You have 72 hours to dismantle that monstrosity, or the fines will begin accruing at a rate of $500 per day. The voice was as sharp and unpleasant as a shard of broken glass. It belonged to Carol, our neighborhood's self-appointed Queen and Homeowners Association president. The monstrosity in question was my brand new, state-of-the-art greenhouse, a structure of gleaming steel and polycarbonate panels that was, in my admittedly biased opinion, a work of architectural beauty. It was also the last thing my wife, Helen, and I had designed together before I lost her. I had moved to the Willows seeking peace. After a career as an agricultural geneticist, a life spent coaxing secrets from seeds and soil, I wanted quiet. Helen's illness had been a long, drawn-out siege, and after she was gone, the silence in our old house was deafening. This new place, with its manicured lawns and quiet streets, felt like a soft place to land. A place to cultivate a new, smaller life focused on the boutique-produced business Helen and I had dreamed of. The greenhouse was the heart of that dream. It was my sanctuary, my laboratory, and my connection to her. Every beam and pane of glass had been meticulously planned, approved by the county, and installed by professionals. I had the permits to prove it, filed neatly in a binder on my desk. Carol, however, didn't care about binders or permits. She cared about power. She patrolled the neighborhood in a golf cart she'd christened the Community Cruiser, a mobile throne from which she dispensed judgment. Her authority, as far as I could tell, was absolute because no one had ever dared to challenge it. Her hair was a helmet of blonde spray, her eyes were small and hard, and she wielded the HOA bylaws like a weapon. I believe you'll find everything is in order, I said, keeping my voice level. I had learned long ago that panic is a useless emotion. I submitted the plans to the Architectural Review Committee 3 months ago. They were approved. A thin, cruel smile touched her lips. Ah, yes. The committee has since revisited that approval. We've decided it was granted in error. The structure violates Section C, Paragraph 12 of the Aesthetic Code. It's industrial. The Architectural Review Committee, I would later learn, consisted of Carol, her reflection in the golf cart's rearview mirror, and occasionally her pet poodle, Muffin, when he wasn't busy soiling someone's prize-winning petunias. It's a greenhouse, Carol, I said simply. It's for growing plants. It's an eyesore, she snapped, her voice rising. And it blocks the afternoon sun from my prize-winning roses. This is your only warning. 72 hours. She spun the golf cart around with a dramatic flair, kicking up a spray of perfectly manicured turf, and sped off. I stood there, watching her go, the warm afternoon air suddenly feeling cold. I had come here for peace, but it seemed I had stumbled into a petty kingdom ruled by a tyrant in a tennis skirt. And she had just declared war on my wife's memory. I was not a confrontational man. My life's work involved patience, observation, and methodical problem-solving. You can't rush a genome sequence, and you can't argue a plant into growing faster. I applied the same principles to people. I believed that reason, presented calmly and logically, could solve most disputes. My first step was to consult the thick binder of HOA covenants and restrictions I'd been given at closing. I read the entire document, cover to cover, highlighting every section pertaining to outbuildings, structures, and aesthetic codes. My greenhouse, a custom build designed to blend with the lines of my house, violated none of them. Section C, Paragraph 12, the one she'd cited, referred to commercial-grade chain-link fencing. It had nothing to do with my greenhouse. She was just making it up. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a polite, formal letter. I cited the relevant sections of the bylaws, attached copies of my approved plans and the county permits, and respectfully requested that she rescind the violation notice. I sent it via certified mail, creating a paper trail. It felt like a solid, logical move. A checkmate in the making. Carol's response came not in a letter, but in the form of a bright orange sticker slapped onto the glass door of my greenhouse 2 days later. It was a formal fine notification. $500. The reason listed was failure to comply with a directive of the ARC. The absurdity of it was almost comical. She wasn't even pretending to follow her own rules anymore. This wasn't about bylaws, it was a pure power play. The fine was a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge to my right to exist peacefully on my own property. My neighbor, Frank, saw the sticker from his yard. He was a retired police detective with a weary posture and eyes that had seen too much. He wandered over, shaking his head slowly. "Queen Carol's been at it again, I see," he said, his voice a low rumble. "She seems to think my greenhouse is a threat to national security," I replied, my attempt at humor sounding thin even to my own ears. "To her, it is," Frank said, taking a long look at the structure. "It's something new. Something she didn't personally approve of and can't control. That woman has a pathological need to be in charge of everything. Most folks just pay the fine and do what she says. It's easier. I'm not going to pay a fine for something I had permission to build," I stated firmly. "And I'm certainly not tearing it down." Frank nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "Good. But be careful. She doesn't fight fair. She fights dirty." He was right. The escalation was swift and vindictive. My polite, certified letter was ignored. A second fine notice appeared a few days later, bringing the total to $1,000. Then came the emails, sent to the entire community mailing list. They were masterpieces of passive-aggressive propaganda. Without using my name, Carol wrote about certain residents who showed a flagrant disregard for community harmony and whose unapproved industrial structures were lowering property values for everyone. She implied that my greenhouse was the first step on a slippery slope toward neighborhood decay, a harbinger of rusting cars on lawns and unkempt gardens. People I'd exchanged pleasantries with started avoiding my gaze. A woman who had previously admired my rose bushes now hurried past my house with her head down. I was being quietly, systematically ostracized. The peace I had sought was curdling into a quiet, tense isolation. Then she stooped lower. She began targeting my business. I had a small, unmarked delivery van I used to transport my produce to a few exclusive restaurants in the city. My driver, a polite college kid named Leo, was meticulous about parking legally on the street for the short time it took to load the climate-controlled crates. Carol started calling a towing company, claiming the van was abandoned. The first time, Leo managed to stop the tow truck driver by showing him he was actively loading the vehicle. The second time, he wasn't so lucky. I had to pay nearly $400 to get my van out of impound, a significant bite out of my narrow profit margin. This was no longer just an annoyance. This was a direct assault on my livelihood. The greenhouse wasn't just a hobby, it was the foundation of my new life, the small business that gave my days purpose. It was how I intended to honor Helen's memory and support myself in my retirement. The final straw, the moment the patient, methodical scientist in me was shoved aside by something colder and harder, came on a Tuesday night. I was woken by an alert on my phone from the greenhouse's environmental monitoring system. The internal temperature was plummeting. I threw on a robe and ran outside. The air was cool, but it shouldn't have been cold enough to trigger a critical warning. As I got closer, I saw it. The main breaker switch for the greenhouse's heating and ventilation system, located on an external panel, had been flipped off. My blood ran cold. A few more hours without climate control, and I would have lost an entire crop of highly specialized microgreens and heirloom tomatoes, a loss of thousands of dollars and weeks of work. It was a sensitive, crucial stage of their growth. This wasn't a fine or a nasty email. This was sabotage. I stood there in the moonlight, the silence of the suburban night pressing in on me. There was no proof, of course. No one I could point a finger at. But I knew. Frank's words echoed in my head, "She doesn't fight fair. She fights dirty." In that moment, something inside me shifted. The desire for a peaceful, rational resolution evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. Reason had failed. Politeness had been mistaken for weakness. My attempts to de-escalate had only emboldened her. Carol had pushed me too far. She had threatened my home, my business, and the last tangible piece of my wife I had left. She thought she was dealing with a quiet old man who would eventually fold. She had no idea who I really was. I hadn't spent 40 years designing complex biological systems, analyzing data, and identifying critical weaknesses just to be bullied into submission by a petty tyrant in a golf cart. She had started a war. Now, I was going to finish it. And I was going to use the same skills I used in the lab, patience, precision, and a ruthless attention to detail. I went back inside, not to my bed, but to my office. I pulled out a fresh legal pad. At the top, I wrote 2 words, Project Nightshade. The battle for the Willows had begun. The first phase of Project Nightshade was simple, information. In my old life, I battled fungal blights and genetic drift. I learned that you can't defeat an adversary until you understand it completely. Carol was my new fungal blight. I needed to know her systems, her patterns, her weaknesses. I started with the HOA's public documents. I spent hours online, digging through the county registrar's website, pulling up every filing connected to the Willows Homeowners Association. I downloaded years of meeting minutes, annual budgets, and community newsletters. I read them all, making notes, cross-referencing figures, building a timeline. It was tedious work, but it felt familiar. It was data analysis. A pattern began to emerge. Under Carol's presidency, which had begun 5 years ago, HOA dues had increased by nearly 40%. Yet, community services seemed to have declined. The pool hours were shorter, the landscaping in the common areas looked tired, and a long-promised repair to the community clubhouse roof had never materialized. Where was the money going? The answer, I suspected, lay in the budget's line items. One expense stood out, a recurring, significant payment to a company called Evergreen Solutions. The charges were for grounds maintenance and beautification. The amounts were staggering, far more than what our small community should have been paying for lawn mowing and seasonal planting. I did a business search for Evergreen Solutions. It was a limited liability company, registered just over 5 years ago, right after Carol took office. The registered agent was a post office box in a neighboring town. There was no physical address, no website, no phone number. It was a ghost company. This was more than just poor management. This was a red flag the size of a billboard. While I was digging into the financials, I also took steps to protect my property. The sabotage of my greenhouse's power supply had been a wake-up call. I was dealing with someone who had no reservations about causing real, tangible damage. I contacted a security firm and had a comprehensive camera system installed. They weren't cheap, off-the-shelf cameras. They were high-definition, weatherproof, with night vision and motion-activated recording. I placed them strategically, covering every angle of my house, my yard, and especially the greenhouse. One camera was positioned specifically to get a clear shot of the electrical panel. I wanted a high-resolution portrait of the next person who decided to tamper with my work. I also had a quiet conversation with Frank. I met him at the end of his driveway one afternoon, out of earshot of any curious neighbors. I laid out what I had found, the budget discrepancies, the shell company, the timing. Frank listened intently, his old detective instincts kicking in. His face, usually relaxed in retirement, hardened into a familiar, professional mask. Shell company tied to a P.O. box, billing an organization run by one person with total financial control, he said, letting out a low whistle. That's the classic embezzlement playbook. But suspicion isn't proof. You need to connect her to that company directly. How? I asked. Follow the money, he said, the phrase sounding as natural to him as breathing. But that's hard to do from the outside. The other way is to bait the trap. Make her overplay her hand. People like her, they get arrogant. They think they're untouchable. That's when they make mistakes. Baiting the trap. The idea took root in my mind. I was a scientist. I designed experiments. This would be my most important one yet. I needed the right bait, something that would provoke Carol into an emotional, sloppy response. The opportunity arrived a week later, disguised as a routine phone call. It was from the office of the state governor. I had, on a long shot, sent a sample box of my produce to the chef at the governor's mansion, a man renowned for his commitment to locally sourced, high-quality ingredients. He had been impressed. Very impressed. They wanted to discuss a contract for me to become a primary supplier of specialty vegetables and herbs for official state functions. It was a massive breakthrough for my small business, a validation of everything Helen and I had dreamed of. But as I hung up the phone, a second, colder thought entered my mind. This was the bait. I didn't keep the news a secret. I did the opposite. I mentioned it casually to the mailman, knowing he was the neighborhood's biggest gossip. I told Leo, my driver, to talk about it with the other kids who did odd jobs in the community. I wanted the news to spread organically, to reach Carol's ears as a piece of neighborhood chatter. It didn't take long. 2 days later, I was outside pruning a climbing rose when her golf cart screeched to a halt at my curb. "I hear you're getting ambitious," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Trying to make a name for yourself." "Just trying to run a business, Carol," I said, not looking up from my work. "This is a residential community," she sniffed. "Not a commercial farm. All this new traffic, these deliveries, it's disruptive. The board will have to review the legality of your little enterprise." Her composure was slipping. The thought of me gaining a measure of prestige, of succeeding in a way that had nothing to do with her or her petty kingdom, was clearly eating at her. My success was an affront to her authority. The trap was set. The cameras were rolling. Now, all I had to do was wait for the creature to emerge from the darkness. I didn't have to wait long. The attack came 4 nights later. It was just after 2 in the morning when the motion sensor alert chimed on my phone. I sat up in bed, my heart thumping. I pulled up the live feed from the camera pointed at the side of the greenhouse. The image was crystal clear, rendered in the eerie monochrome of infrared. A figure, bundled in a dark hoodie and sweatpants, was creeping along the side of the structure. They were carrying a small pump sprayer. My breath caught in my throat. The figure stopped directly in front of the main intake vent for my hydroponic system. This vent drew in outside air, filtered it, and circulated it through the nutrient-rich water that fed my most delicate plants. Anything introduced into that vent would be instantly atomized and distributed throughout the entire system. It would be a catastrophe, poisoning everything from the inside out. The figure raised the nozzle of the sprayer. For a moment, the hood slipped back, and the infrared camera captured her face in perfect, damning detail. It was Carol. Her face was a mask of pure malice. She looked around furtively, then began to spray a clear liquid directly into the vent. She was methodical, soaking the filter, ensuring maximum contamination. I watched, my body rigid, a cold fury washing over me. I wasn't watching a petty HOA dispute anymore. I was watching a felony in progress. This was criminal destruction of property, a deliberate attempt to ruin my business. She finished her work, gave the area one last paranoid glance, and scurried back into the darkness. I didn't call the police. Not yet. A simple vandalism charge wasn't enough. Frank's voice was in my head, make her overplay her hand. This was a key piece of evidence, but it wasn't the checkmate. This was proof of her methods, but not her motive. I needed to connect it to the money. I saved the video file, backing it up to 3 separate locations. Then I went out to the greenhouse. I took a sterile sample from the now saturated intake filter. I would have it analyzed. I already knew what I would find, a potent, broad-spectrum herbicide. The next day, I received another official notice from the HOA. This one was different. It was a summons to a disciplinary hearing at the next monthly meeting. The charge was operating an unauthorized commercial enterprise in a residential zone. She was building her official case against me, creating a paper trail to justify shutting me down, completely unaware that I now had a digital file that could send her to prison. The stage was being set for a confrontation. She thought it would be her stage, her show. She had no idea that I was the one writing the script. The week leading up to the HOA meeting was a masterclass in psychological warfare, with me as the sole, silent audience. Carol, buoyed by her secret act of sabotage and the impending hearing, was insufferable. She paraded her power, sending out a flurry of emails about minor infractions around the neighborhood. Mrs. Gable's garden gnome was an inch too tall. Mr. Henderson's recycling bin was visible from the street for 3 hours past the designated time. She was tightening her grip, reminding everyone of her authority before the public execution she had planned for me. The community, in turn, grew quieter, more fearful. Neighbors who knew what she was doing to me offered sympathetic glances but no words of support. They were too afraid of ending up on her list. I, on the other hand, projected an aura of calm defeat. I let my shoulders slump a little when I walked to the mailbox. I returned her smug waves with a weary nod. I needed her to believe she had won, that I was coming to the meeting a broken man, ready to beg for mercy. Arrogance, as Frank had said, makes people sloppy. The evening of the meeting arrived. The community clubhouse was a sterile, beige room filled with uncomfortable folding chairs. The air was thick with a mixture of cheap air freshener and palpable tension. About 30 residents were there, most looking like they would rather be anywhere else. Carol sat at the head table, flanked by the two other board members, a nervous-looking accountant named Stan and a woman named Brenda who seemed to take her fashion cues from funeral directors. Carol was in her element. She banged a small gavel to call the meeting to order, a theatrical gesture that was entirely unnecessary. They went through the mundane business first, minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's report. Stan mumbled his way through the financials, his voice barely audible. When he got to the landscaping line item, he rushed through the figure for Evergreen Solutions. I watched the faces in the room. No one blinked. They had heard the name so many times it had become meaningless background noise. Finally, Carol cleared her throat. And now, we move to new business. The final item on the agenda is the disciplinary hearing for the resident at 112 Willow Creek Lane regarding the operation of an unauthorized commercial enterprise. All eyes turned to me. I could feel their pity and their relief that it wasn't them in the hot seat. As you all know, Carol continued, her voice resonating with false gravity, the Willows is a community dedicated to maintaining a peaceful, residential character. This is what protects our property values and our quality of life. Unfortunately, it has come to the board's attention that the resident at this address has been operating a large-scale agricultural business, complete with commercial vehicles and disruptive activity, in direct violation of our covenants. She laid out her case, twisting facts and fabricating others. She spoke of constant truck traffic, Leo's van, twice a week, and industrial noise, which I assumed was the quiet hum of my greenhouse's ventilation fans. It was a compelling performance, full of righteous indignation. When she finished, she looked at me, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Do you have anything to say in your defense before the board votes on the levying of fines and the issuance of a cease and desist order? This was my moment. The first reveal. I didn't stand up. I remained seated, leaning forward slightly. I do, Carol, I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the silent room. But first, I have a question for our treasurer. Stan, could you please go back to the budget? I'm curious about the payments to Evergreen Solutions. A confused murmur went through the crowd. Carol's eyes narrowed. That is not relevant to this hearing. I believe it is, I said, keeping my gaze locked on her. The payments seem quite high for the services rendered. I was wondering, has the board ever solicited competitive bids for landscaping services? Or is Evergreen Solutions the only company you've considered for the last 5 years? Stan looked at Carol, terrified, like a mouse asking a cat for permission to breathe. Carol shot him a look that could curdle milk. Evergreen Solutions has been a reliable and excellent partner for this community, she snapped. Their work speaks for itself. This is a pathetic attempt to deflect from your own violations. Is it? I asked, letting the question hang in the air. I'm just a simple gardener, but it seems to me that paying a company with no listed address or phone number over $100,000 a year to mow a few acres of grass is unusual. I would think the residents of this community would be interested in ensuring their dues are being spent responsibly. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The pity in people's eyes was being replaced by something else, curiosity. A seed of doubt had been planted. They had all been grumbling about the rising dues for years. Now, I had given their discontent a name, Evergreen Solutions. Carol's face was turning a blotchy red. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. This is slander, she hissed, her voice rising in pitch. You are making baseless accusations to intimidate the board. This hearing is over. The board finds you in violation. She banged the gavel furiously. A fine of $5,000 is imposed, and you are ordered to cease all commercial operations immediately. If you do not comply, we will see you in court. She stood up, declaring the meeting adjourned. But it was too late. The damage was done. I hadn't presented a single piece of evidence, but by simply asking a few logical questions, I had cracked the perfect facade of her authority. People were whispering to each other as they filed out, and the whispers weren't about my greenhouse anymore. They were about Evergreen Solutions. Carol had reacted exactly as I'd predicted, with rage, denial, and threats. She had revealed her weakness. She was terrified of anyone looking too closely at the books. I walked home in the cool night air, a grim sense of satisfaction settling over me. The trap had been sprung. She didn't know it yet, but she was already caught. Now, I just had to wait for her to exhaust herself struggling against the wires. The first phase was over. Now, for the final escalation. Carol's response to the meeting was not subtle. Having been publicly challenged, however gently, she abandoned all pretense of procedure and went on the warpath. She was a cornered animal, lashing out with every weapon at her disposal. The official HOA violation notices began appearing daily, taped to my front door. My grass was 1/4 of an inch too high. A single dandelion was spotted near my driveway. My mailbox, she claimed, was an unapproved shade of black. The fines piled up, reaching a comical, imaginary sum. It was harassment, pure and simple, designed to bury me in paper and wear me down. But then she escalated to a far more dangerous level. She began a vicious smear campaign, moving from the community email list to a private Facebook group she controlled with an iron fist. Her accusations became wild and unhinged. She posted that my so-called organic produce was grown using dangerous, unregistered chemicals imported from a foreign country. She suggested my greenhouse was a biohazard, a threat to the health of the neighborhood's children and pets. She invented a story about seeing me late at night, handling mysterious glowing containers. It was insane, but in the vacuum of a quiet suburban community, fear is a powerful motivator. A mother posted asking if it was safe to let her kids play outside. Someone else claimed their dog had gotten sick after walking past my property. The hysteria was building, stoked by Carol's daily pronouncements. This was a calculated attack, designed not just to shut down my business but to destroy my reputation and turn me into a pariah. She was trying to make my life so miserable that I would have no choice but to sell my house and leave. Then came the official complaints. I received visits from 3 different agencies in a single week. First, a county code enforcement officer, responding to an anonymous tip about an illegal commercial structure. He took one look at my permits and apologized for wasting my time. Next, an inspector from the state's Department of Agriculture, investigating a complaint about the use of banned pesticides. I walked him through my entire operation, from the organic nutrient solutions to my integrated pest management system, which used beneficial insects, not chemicals. He left impressed, even asking for my card. The third visit was the most unnerving. An agent from the Environmental Protection Agency, following up on a report that I was improperly disposing of hazardous waste. The complaint was so outlandish that the agent seemed embarrassed to be there. He did a cursory inspection and left, shaking his head. Each visit was a disruption, a source of profound stress. I was being forced to defend myself against lies, to prove my innocence over and over again. Carol was using the very systems meant to protect the public as a tool of personal harassment. She was turning the weight of the government against me. I documented everything. Every fine, every email, every post, every official visit. I was building a mountain of evidence, a detailed record of her escalating campaign of persecution. But I still lacked the final, undeniable link. The smoking gun that connected Carol directly to the financial fraud. And then, it came to me. It arrived in the form of a plain manila envelope left in my mailbox, with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a short, handwritten note. "She's gone too far. I can't be a part of this anymore. Use this to stop her." There was no signature. My hands trembled slightly as I plugged the drive into my laptop. It contained a single folder filled with scanned documents. They were bank statements for Evergreen Solutions LLC. And there were copies of cashier's checks. The statements showed the monthly payments from the HOA account going in. And then, a few days later, they showed transfers going out. Large, round sums transferred to a personal investment account. An account in the name of Carol Mason. Her maiden name. The final documents were the most damning. They were invoices from Evergreen Solutions to the HOA. The descriptions of the work were laughably vague: spring beautification project, summer grounds enhancement. Each one was signed for approval by Carol, as HOA president. And at the bottom of each invoice, listed as the contact person for Evergreen Solutions, was the name C. Mason. She wasn't just embezzling. She was approving payments from the HOA to herself, using a shell company registered under her maiden name. It was brazen, arrogant, and profoundly stupid. It was wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement, all rolled into one neat, prosecutable package. The whistleblower, I realized, had to be her husband. I had seen him at the meeting. A quiet, beaten-down man who had watched her performance with a look of deep shame. He must have reached his breaking point. I now had everything. The video of her committing a crime against my property. The lab report confirming the substance she used was a potent herbicide. A documented pattern of harassment and malicious reporting to government agencies. And now, incontrovertible proof of a multi-year felony fraud scheme. The time for defense was over. The time for quiet investigation was over. It was time to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. The next morning, I called Frank. "I've got it," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I have all of it." I met him an hour later. We sat at his kitchen table, the contents of the USB drive displayed on my laptop screen. He scrolled through the documents, his expression growing grimmer with each click. He watched the video of Carol at the greenhouse, his jaw tight. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. "In 30 years on the force," he said quietly, "I've seen a lot of crooks. The dumb ones, the smart ones. But the arrogant ones, they're always the easiest to catch. They think they're so much smarter than everyone else that they leave a trail a mile wide." He looked at me. "So, what's your next move? You have more than enough to go to the police right now." "I know," I said. "And we will. But a quiet arrest isn't enough. She built her power by humiliating people publicly. She deserves to have that power dismantled in the same way. She tried to ruin me in front of this community. I want the community to see exactly who she is." Frank nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Poetic justice. I like it. But we need to do this by the book. One wrong move and a sharp lawyer could get the whole case thrown out." With Frank's guidance, we spent the rest of the day preparing. We organized the evidence into a clear, chronological narrative. We made multiple, secure copies of everything. Frank had a contact in the district attorney's economic crimes unit. He made a call, speaking in the clipped, professional language of law enforcement. He explained the situation, the strength of the evidence, and my desire for a controlled, public reveal. The DA's office, intrigued by the slam-dunk nature of the case and the potential for a high-profile local conviction, agreed to the plan. They would have plainclothes officers ready to act on my signal. The final piece of the plan was to set the stage. I used the HOA's own bylaws against her. I drafted a petition, citing a clause that allowed residents to call a special emergency meeting if signed by 10% of the homeowners. The stated purpose of the meeting was to address urgent and potentially criminal allegations threatening the financial solvency and reputation of our community. Getting the signatures was easier than I expected. The seed of doubt I had planted at the last meeting had taken root. People were worried. My quiet, consistent refusal to back down had earned me a measure of respect. They signed, their hands shaking slightly, feeling for the first time like they were part of a rebellion. I submitted the petition to the board. Carol had no choice but to schedule the meeting. She set it for a week later, in the same beige clubhouse. She sent out a notice, framing it as a chance to dispel the malicious rumors being spread by a disgruntled resident. She was walking into her own execution, convinced she was the one holding the axe. The countdown had begun. The night of the special meeting felt like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy, charged, and silent. The clubhouse was packed. Far more people had shown up than for a typical meeting. Word had spread. The deliberately dramatic title of the meeting had done its job. This wasn't about budgets or lawn maintenance, this was a showdown. I arrived early and set up my equipment, a laptop and a high-lumen projector aimed at a large, pull-down screen on the far wall. I saw Frank near the back, looking like any other board retiree, but I noticed two other men and a woman I didn't recognize standing near the exits. They were calm, observant, and they scanned the crowd with professional eyes. The DA's people. Carol made her entrance a few minutes late, a queen arriving at her court. She was dressed in a severe navy blue suit, a power outfit. She radiated an almost tangible aura of smug confidence. She saw my projector and sneered. Bringing a little slideshow to plead your case, she said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. How quaint. I just gave her a small, tight smile. Something like that. She took her seat at the head table and banged the gavel with her usual theatricality. This special meeting has been called at the request of a small but vocal minority of residents. We are here to address certain, baseless allegations. I will now turn the floor over to the resident from 112 Willow Creek Lane, who has seen fit to disrupt the peace of our community with his fantasies. She gestured to me with a dismissive wave of her hand. I walked to the front of the room and stood beside my laptop. I didn't look at Carol. I looked at my neighbors. I saw the faces of the people who had averted their eyes, the people who had whispered behind my back, the people who had been too afraid to speak up. Good evening, I began, my voice calm and even. I know many of you have heard things about me recently. About my home, my business. You've been told I'm a danger to this community. You've been told I'm breaking the rules. Tonight, I'm here to talk about the rules. And about the person who enforces them. I clicked the first slide. It was a simple timeline. It started with the date my greenhouse was approved by the ARC. The next point was the date Carol retroactively denied it. I went through the harassment, point by point, the false fines, the towing of my van, the slanderous emails. With each point, I projected a copy of the actual document on the screen, the fine, the impound receipt, her own emails. A low murmur started to build in the room. People were seeing the pattern, the relentless, targeted nature of the attacks, all laid out in black and white. This was a campaign of harassment designed to drive me out, I said. But the question is why? Why such a vicious reaction to a simple greenhouse? I believe the answer is because I started asking questions about where our money is going. I clicked to the next slide. It was the HOA's budget, with the line item for Evergreen Solutions circled in red. Over the last 5 years, I said, my voice like a hammer striking an anvil, our HOA has paid over $500,000 to this company. A company with no phone number, no address, and no other known clients. Carol stood up. This is outrageous. These are lies. This is not the purpose of this meeting. Please, Carol, I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm. The best part is yet to come. I clicked again. The screen went black for a moment, and then it was filled with the grainy, infrared image from my security camera. The room went dead silent. We all watched as the hooded figure crept into the frame. We watched her raise the pump sprayer. We watched the hood fall back, revealing Carol's face, twisted in a mask of hate. We watched her poison my hydroponic system. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a physical sound, a wave of shock and disbelief. People were turning to stare at Carol, their mouths open. Her face had gone completely white. All the color had drained from it, leaving a pasty, terrified mask. That's fake, she shrieked, her voice cracking. It's a trick. He doctored that video. Did I doctor the lab report, too? I asked, clicking to the next slide. The analysis from the state lab appeared on the screen, identifying the substance on the filter as a concentrated, commercial-grade herbicide, illegal for residential use. The room erupted into chaos. People were shouting, pointing. And did I doctor these? I yelled over the noise, my voice finally rising with the cold fury I had suppressed for so long. I clicked through the final slides. The bank statements for Evergreen Solutions. The transfers to her personal account. The invoices she had submitted to the HOA, and then approved herself. Her maiden name, C. Mason, was on every single one. The proof was undeniable, absolute. It was all there, on the screen, for everyone to see. The embezzlement. The fraud. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it all. Carol was babbling, a stream of incoherent denials and accusations. He's a liar. A criminal. He's framing me. In her panic, she made her final, fatal mistake. I was protecting the community's assets, she screamed. I moved the money to keep it safe from his influence. It was for your own good. A confession. A full, public confession in a room full of witnesses. That was the signal. Frank's friends at the back of the room began to move. The two men and the woman walked calmly but purposefully to the front. They held up their badges. Police. Everyone stay calm. The room fell into a stunned silence. One of the officers approached Carol. Carol, the detective said, his voice devoid of any emotion. You are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and felony destruction of property. The color that had drained from her face came rushing back in a tide of pure rage. She looked from the detective to me, her eyes burning with a venom that was almost pure. This was the moment of her complete and utter ruin, and she knew it. As the detective took her arm to place the handcuffs on her, she lunged, not at him, but in my direction, a wild, desperate animal. You, she screamed, her voice a raw shriek of hatred. You'll regret this. I'll destroy you. I'll burn you to the ground. It was her last, impotent threat. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the silent room. As they led her away, sobbing and still screaming threats, a strange thing happened. Someone started to clap. Then another person. And another. Soon, the entire room was filled with applause. It wasn't for me. It was for the end of the fear. It was the sound of a community taking its first breath of free air after years of being suffocated. I stood there, by my laptop, the projector still glowing on the screen behind me. Project Nightshade was complete. The blight had been eradicated. The aftermath of Carol's public downfall was swift and decisive. The community, once cowed and silent, found its voice. The two remaining board members, Stan and Brenda, resigned in disgrace the following day, issuing a joint letter claiming they had been repeatedly misled by Carol. No one believed them, but their departure cleared the way for a fresh start. An emergency election was held. A new board was voted in, led by Frank, who reluctantly agreed to serve a one-year term to get things back on track. Their first official act was to hold a public meeting where they formally voted to void every fine Carol had ever levied against me. They issued a written apology on behalf of the HOA and had it published in the community newsletter. Their second act was to hire a forensic accountant. The investigation revealed the true extent of Carol's theft. Over her 5-year reign, she had managed to embezzle nearly $600,000 from the community's reserve funds. Money that should have gone to repairing the clubhouse roof, resurfacing the tennis courts, and maintaining the common areas had instead been funneled into her personal investment portfolio. Carol's legal troubles were just beginning. Faced with the mountain of evidence I had provided, she had no defense. The district attorney prosecuted the case with vigor. She was convicted on all counts. The judge, citing her complete lack of remorse and the calculated abuse of her position of trust, sentenced her to 8 years in state prison. The court also ordered full restitution. Her assets were frozen, and her house, the one with the prize-winning roses that she claimed my greenhouse had shaded, was sold at auction to repay the money she had stolen from her neighbors. Her husband, the quiet man who had provided the final piece of the puzzle, filed for divorce and moved out of state, finally free of her tyrannical presence. Her ruin was absolute, a self-inflicted demolition of a life built on arrogance and deceit. In the weeks and months that followed, a slow but steady change came over the Willows. The oppressive atmosphere of fear lifted like a fog. Neighbors started talking to each other again. People began planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. A family put up a basketball hoop, and instead of a fine, they got offers from other dads to come play. The community began to heal, to breathe. The oppressive, beige rules that Carol had enforced with such glee were systematically dismantled and replaced with common sense. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would stop me on my walks to thank me. I was grateful for their kindness, but I deflected the praise. I hadn't set out to be a crusader. I was just a man who had been pushed too far, who had used the skills he had to defend his peace and his wife's legacy. My business, once threatened with extinction, began to flourish. The notoriety of the case, which was covered in the local paper, paradoxically brought me new clients. And the contract with the governor's mansion was finalized. My little greenhouse, the monstrosity that had started it all, was now providing perfect, jewel-like vegetables for the most discerning palates in the state. One evening, a few months after Carol's sentencing, I was standing in the greenhouse, the air warm and fragrant with the smell of damp earth and growing things. The setting sun cast long shadows through the glass panes, the same panes that had been the source of so much conflict. I was inspecting a new crop of heirloom tomatoes, their skins a deep, glossy red. My phone rang. It was the governor's chief of staff. "I just wanted to call you personally," he said, his voice warm. "The governor hosted a dinner for the Japanese ambassador tonight. The chef served your tomatoes in a simple salad. The ambassador spent 5 minutes raving about them. He said he hadn't tasted anything like it since his childhood. You made our state look very good tonight." I thanked him, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. After I hung up, I stood there in the quiet hum of the fans, looking at the rows of thriving plants. Helen would have loved this. She would have loved the science of it, the beauty of it, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something wonderful from a simple seed. This place, this business, it was all for her. And it was safe now. I had learned a hard lesson. Peace is not a passive state, sometimes, it must be fought for. Kindness is not weakness, but it can be mistaken for it. And some people, consumed by their own hunger for power, will continue to take and take until they meet a force that will not yield. I hadn't wanted a war. I had just wanted to be left alone to tend my garden. But in the end, I had to burn down a petty tyrant's kingdom to protect my small patch of earth. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing my greenhouse in a soft, golden light, I felt a profound sense of tranquility settle over me. The war was over. The peace was won. And it was more beautiful than I had ever imagined.